I don't know about you, but I love a good story. Actually, let me change that. I do know about you because I believe that we as humans are drawn in by good stories. It's just part of our DNA. It may not be the same type of story that gets all of us, but we love a good story. And I think that's why I like movies so much. A good story told well can just completely envelop you. For me, it's action movies for the most part. That and I've said this before, sports-related movies. And you put something that's based on a true story, and I'm even more hooked into it. You get me hooked with a story in the first little bit of a movie or a TV show or a book, it doesn't really seem to matter at that point what kind of strange twists or turns or weird directions that the story goes. It takes a lot to get me to walk away from it before the conclusion. But you miss me at the very beginning, and you're probably not going to get my attention later on. Or you probably won't even get to the point where there is a later on. There have been a few stories over the last few years that I would have never thought that I would have enjoyed or even gotten sucked into, but I started them and I got hooked. I normally don't do suspense or horror type movies or shows, but I started watching Stranger Things on Netflix back during season 1 when I'd heard all the hype about it, but I didn't realize what it was about until I started it. And the next thing I knew, I'd finished the first season in like 2 days. So, books are the same way for me. If I'm in the mood to read and I pick something up, it better catch my attention right away. That's what a good story does. And the stories that have caught my attention over the years are usually ones that I go back to over and over again. Not all the time, but I often find myself rereading books that grab my attention. Stories that I would call good. And most of the stories that we get caught up in mean something to us, don't they? They teach us. That's how we teach our kids a lot of times. It's through story. Sometimes it's just that break from reality. Sometimes it's a different perspective. Sometimes it's the underdog story that gives us hope for our own situations. Or it's a story that provides a lesson and encouragement for us. There where I grew up in East Tennessee, there's a little town called Jonesboro. It's actually the oldest town in the entire state of Tennessee. And it's only about 10 or 15 minutes from where I grew up, same county. There in the little town of Jonesboro, of all places, is the International Storytelling Center. They actually host a storytelling festival there every year, every fall, that draws crowds from all over the world. In October of this year, I looked it up earlier, they're hosting the 52nd National Storytelling Festival. My point is this, we love a good story. And we learn from good stories, especially when they're told with a particular purpose in mind. Like I said earlier, it's how we teach our kids most of the time, with stories. Sometimes those lessons are good, sometimes those lessons are bad. But make no mistake, a well-told story is going to evoke emotion and thought from the audience. The Christian world has been very fortunate over the years to have some very, very good, stellar storytellers. And I think we need to get back to that. But authors that tell stories in such a way that people inside of Christianity and people on the outside get drawn in. And they may not even realize right away the Christian themes that they're being drawn into. The battle of good versus evil, or the triumph over mental illness and depression, or even some of our best musicians do this in song. In such a way that Christians or non-Christians even get drawn in. They like the music and they get drawn in and they finally start taking a hard look at what the songs are about and get introduced to Christianity that way. There are two authors or storytellers that really come to mind that I think we would do well to imitate. And they were contemporaries. They were friends. We've talked about them before, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They were both top-notch storytellers, and they would actually meet regularly. They would compare their stories, they would give each other ideas, and actually some of their most famous characters were actually based off of one another. And we're familiar with C.S. Lewis in the church. He's considered one of the 20th century's most important Christian authors. We know his apologetics, we know his nonfiction writing a lot. And don't get me wrong, those are important. Books like Mere Christianity should be read and taken very seriously. But Lewis wrote a book series that most would claim on the surface as being a children's series. You're familiar with it, Chronicles of Narnia. But if you've read this series or any one of the 7 books that are in it, I think you understand that there's much more underneath the story of Narnia and Aslan and the 4 brothers and sisters. It really is the story of Christ and His work of redemption. And it's written in such a way that it's hard not to get sucked into it. Christians and non-Christians alike seem to enjoy these books and the movies that have been made based on them. In fact, that's one of the series that I often find myself rereading. Tolkien is a little different. He's not as well known necessarily as a man of faith, but he was Catholic. He was also very influential in Lewis's decision to leave atheism and become a Christian. Lewis chose the Church of England, however, instead of joining Tolkien in the Catholic Church. But Tolkien is probably most famous, most known for writing The Hobbit and the trilogy known as The Lord of the Rings. And these books, the subsequent movies made from them in the early 2000s, are loved around the world. But really at their core, whether you realize it or not, are the same Christian themes that you will see in Lewis's writings. Now go back to this. We need good storytellers and we need good stories to tell. Now I love to tell a good story, but I often don't just pull a story out just to use it in a sermon unless it's really going to meet what we're talking about. Because that's what illustrations are. They're stories. They're meant to introduce or to reinforce a theme that we're going to be looking at in Scripture. It's a way to draw us in, to get our minds going, to connect to the story. And I think one of the more interesting things to me is this, that Jesus was a master storyteller. Actually, maybe I should rephrase that. Jesus is the master storyteller. For the most part, what we have recorded in the 3+ years of public ministry during His earthly lifetime, Jesus taught in stories. They're called parables. He taught in parables. And a parable is just a story with a meaning. Merriam-Webster defines a parable as a short, simple story illustrating a moral, spiritual truth. We have other examples throughout the Gospels of Jesus teaching without parables, such as, the Sermon on the Mount comes to mind. But for the most part, when speaking publicly, He taught in parables. He would take His direct disciples aside often and explain the parables, but to the crowd, to the masses, He would leave it at the simple stories with a meaning. And He did this with a purpose. Actually, did you know that teaching in parables, that by teaching in parables, Jesus is again claiming to be the Messiah? That's what this series is all about, is talking about ways that Jesus clearly claimed to be the Messiah. It was prophesied in the Old Testament that the Messiah would come teaching in parables. Now that alone doesn't prove that Jesus is the Messiah, although we've said often, I believe that He is. But it is one of the ways that we see the Old Testament prophecies pointing to Jesus. So this morning we're going to take a look at one of Jesus' parables as we wrap up. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to look at all of His parables. We don't even have the time to look at multiple of His parables. But we're going to be in Matthew 13, and we're going to look at one of the parables recorded there. But before that, We're going to look at verses 10 through 17 and verses 34 and 35. Why Jesus taught in parables. Starting in verse 10, then the disciples came up and asked him, why are you speaking to them in parables? He answered, because the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given for you to know, but it has not been given to them. For whoever has, more will be given to him, and he will have more than enough. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. That is why I speak to them in parables, because looking they do not see, and hearing they do not listen or understand. Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them, which says, you will listen and listen, but never understand. You will look and look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown callous. Their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn back, and I would heal them. Blessed are your eyes, because they do see, and your ears, because they do hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see the things you see, but didn't see them, to hear the things you hear, but didn't hear them. And then verse 34, Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables, and he did not tell them anything without a parable, so that what was spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. I will open my mouth in parables. I will declare things kept secret from the foundation of the world. So Matthew 13 opens with Jesus teaching in parables. And after this first parable, known as the parable of the sower that we're going to look at here in a little bit, his disciples come to Jesus and ask, why? Why are you teaching in parables? And he answers first that the secrets to the kingdom have been given to them, but not to the crowds. That may seem harsh. It may even seem like Jesus is saying that those on the outside can never come to Christ, but like it's purposely being hidden from them. That's not really what he's saying here. Jesus' parables had two distinct purposes. First, to reveal the truth to those who were willing to hear and believe. And second, to conceal the truth from those who willingly rejected truth because of their calloused hearts. See, the hiddenness component of Jesus' teaching, like I said earlier, may seem harsh, but since the greater exposure to the truth increases one's accountability to God in judgment, the concealment may represent God's graciousness toward those whom he knew would be unresponsive. But I think more than that, we have to look at the meaning of a particular word here that's translated as secrets in our language, but because if we get the meaning of it in Greek, then the rest of what Jesus is saying kind of starts taking shape. William Barclay states that the Greek word here in the New Testament times was the technical name for something which is unintelligible to the outsider, but is crystal clear to anyone who has been initiated. He continues, he actually uses the Lord's Supper as an example of this. He says that basically, that one who has never seen such a thing before, it looks like a company of men and women eating little pieces of bread and drinking little sips of grape juice, and it might even appear ridiculous to those people. I understand a little bit what he means here, because I remember as a kid, when the trays were passed in church, that I thought that communion was just like a mid-morning snack, and that the offering was how we were paying for it. I didn't understand what was really happening. I didn't understand the meaning behind it. Barclay continued, though, he says, but to the men and women who know what they're doing, to those who are initiated into its meanings, it's the most precious and most moving act of worship in the church. So what Jesus is saying to his disciples basically is this: outsiders can't understand what I say. But you know me, you're my disciples, you can understand. See, Christianity can't really be understood from the outside, only the inside. It's that personal encounter with Jesus that people can understand. To criticize from the outside is really to criticize in ignorance. it's only those who are prepared to become disciples who can enter into the most precious things of the Christian faith. He's not keeping anyone from it. But once they do come to Him, they'll start to understand. In the middle of all of this, Jesus quotes Isaiah 6, verses 9 and 10. Isaiah says this, or actually, Isaiah records this, and he replied, meaning God, and he replied, "Go, say to these people, keep listening but do not understand, keep looking but do not perceive, make the minds of these people dull, deafen their ears and blind their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their minds, turn back and be healed." See, Isaiah was a prophet with a message of judgment. And God's commission recognized that because of its sin, Israel's healing could only come about through their punishment. Isaiah's message from God would serve only to distance them, really, from even more so than where they were. These verses quoted in the New Testament explain why Jesus taught in parables and to explain also the lack of people's response to the gospel. So Jesus is using God's response to Isaiah. He's saying that the people of his day are going to react just like they did to Isaiah's words. Not that God is hiding it or causing it, but because they're so intent on not listening and intent on doing things the way they want and have always done them. Matthew actually frequently throughout his gospel explains how Jesus' ministry fulfilled prophecy. And again here he says that Jesus himself described this fulfillment of Isaiah 6, 9 through 10. And the application of this text to Jesus' contemporaries implies that Israel's hardened rejection of Jesus was not permanent. It's the part of Isaiah that we didn't read, verses 11 and through 13 in Isaiah 6 actually go on to show that the hearts of the people would someday be softened and that God would preserve a righteous remnant in Israel. So Jesus using this is showing, again, a stony resistance but not a permanent resistance to his words. After this, Jesus continued teaching the crowd in more parables. After he explained the parable of the sower to the disciples. So he teaches two more parables. And Matthew then stops to explain just a little more in detail why Jesus taught in parables. Let's look at 34 and 35 again. It says, Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables, and he did not tell them anything without a parable, so that what was spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. I will open my mouth in parables. I will declare things kept secret from the foundation of the world. This is actually a quote from Psalm 78, verse 2. But to get us a little better context, let's look at Psalm 78, 1 through 3. It says, "My people, hear my instruction. Listen to the words from my mouth. I will declare wise sayings. I will speak mysteries from the past, things we have heard and known, and that our ancestors have passed down to us." Asaph, who was the psalmist here, who wrote this, is saying that he knows what he's saying will be understood. And that he is recalling men and women to the truth that both they and their ancestors have known. The truth is that the words of Isaiah and the use that Jesus made of them must be read with this insight and with an attempt to put ourselves in the position of both Isaiah and of Jesus. And they actually tell us about three different things here. First, it tells of a prophet's bewilderment. Isaiah brought a message to people, and for Isaiah, this message was crystal clear. And he was absolutely bewildered that the people couldn't understand it. But if you've ever tried to teach anything for any length of time, I'm sure you can understand, right, Bobby? Second, it tells of Isaiah's despair. It was his feeling that his preaching was actually doing more harm than good. That he might as well be speaking to a brick wall. that there was no way into the minds and the hearts of this deaf and blind people, and that they seemed to be getting worse instead of getting better. Again, if you've tried to teach anything, I'm sure you can relate to that. And finally, these words actually tell us more than just Isaiah's bewilderment and despair. They also tell of his ultimate faith in this. We find ourselves face to face with a Jewish conviction, apart from which much of what Isaiah said, much of what Jesus said, and really much of what the early church said is not fully intelligible. Because, to put it simply, a primary article of Jewish belief was that nothing in this world happens outside of the will of God. When they said nothing, they meant literally nothing. It was just as much God's will when people didn't listen as when they did. It was just as much God's will when people refused to understand the truth as when they welcomed it. The Jews would hold fast to the belief that everything had its place and purpose of God, and that somehow God was weaving together success and failure, good and evil, in a web of His design. See, the ultimate purpose of everything was good, and the apparent evil that we would see is gathered up in the larger good, for all is within the plan of God. That's what Isaiah was feeling when he wrote God's words there. At first he was bewildered and in despair. But then the light came, and in effect he's saying, I can't understand the conduct of this people, but I know that all this failure is somehow in the ultimate purpose of God. He will use it for His own ultimate glory and for the ultimate good of mankind. And Jesus took these words of Isaiah and He used them to encourage His disciples. Jesus is basically saying, I know this looks disappointing. I know how you're feeling when in their minds and in their hearts people refuse to receive the truth, when their eyes refuse to recognize it. But in this too, there's purpose, and someday you'll see. And that leads us into the parable and the explanation of this parable in Jesus' own words that we want to close with this morning. Again, Matthew 13 starts out with one of Jesus' most well-known parables outside of the parable of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. Matthew 13, 3 through 9, parable of the sower. When he told them many things in parables, saying, Consider the sower who went out to sow. As he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, and it grew up quickly since the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked it. Still other seed fell on good ground and produced fruit, some 100, some 60, some 30 times what was sown. Let anyone who has ears listen. That was the parable again that Jesus told that prompted the disciples to ask Him why He was teaching in parables. And that was the parable that He chose to explain after explaining that He was teaching in parables basically because the Messiah was prophesied to come teaching that. Think about what we just said about the passage from Psalm 78. That there would be some that received the message, some that didn't, and maybe even some that we couldn't tell whether they received the message or not. That's exactly what this parable of the sower is about. Some will receive the Word of God and take it to heart. Others will seem like they've received it, but then fall away. Actually, let's just look at His own explanation of it. In verses 18 through 23, Jesus continued. He says, So listen to the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word about the kingdom and doesn't understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the one sown along the path. And the one sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. But he has no root and is short-lived. When distress or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he falls away. Now the one sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the worries of this age and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. But the one sown on the good ground, this is the one who hears and understands the word, who does produce fruit and yields some 100, some 60, some 30 times what was sown. I've told you from the beginning of this series that this is ultimately about Jesus claiming to be the Messiah. And the fact that he taught in parables does fulfill some of the prophecies about the coming Messiah. But I want to take a minute here to go just a little bit of a different direction as we conclude. Because I don't know about you, but I get discouraged from time to time, especially when I look at the state of the world that we're living in. Even in my own personal one-on-one interactions, sometimes I get discouraged because it doesn't seem like I'm making a difference. That people are still living the way they want to, doing what they want to do, and they're not living sold out for Jesus. But then I read this parable and the passage from Isaiah, the passage from Psalms, and I'm encouraged because I'm reminded that what I'm called to do is to spread the seed. It's to tell others about Jesus and the gospel. And to do that faithfully. Now, sometimes I'm still discouraged because I fail at spreading the seed like I should, but that's a different topic for a different time. What we are called to do as disciples is to make other disciples. But we also realize we can't force people into that relationship. We need to be building relationships with people, spreading the seed in their lives, and when we have the opportunity to, helping to cultivate the ground, so to speak. Explaining what we can, when we can, and helping them better receive the word. But ultimately, what we are responsible for is spreading the seed. Not what is it, when it is received, or where it is received. Now that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter how we tell someone about Jesus, because it is very important how we do that. Relationships and building trust with people are going to be far better than just walking up to a random stranger on the street. But we have to remember that ultimately how someone responds, how the seed is cultivated, is really between that person and God. God may use us to help cultivate the heart from rocky to fertile ground. But the growth is not up to us. What is up to us is that we have to be ready to be used by God. We have to be open to the Spirit's prompting of who we need to talk to and when. We have to be ready to sow, and when given the opportunity, to cultivate the ground. Being in relationship with those that we have a chance to that don't know Christ yet. And when God presents the opportunity to sow on fertile ground, don't miss the chance. But again, He's the one in charge of the growth. And I'll end with this because I find it fascinating. A harvest of 10 to 20 times what was sown was considered a bumper crop given the primitive agricultural technology of the age when Jesus was talking here. So the amazing harvest described by Jesus' parable, where He says 160 or even 30 times the amount of what was sown, shows that true disciples produce fruit in a miraculous quantity. And of course, that's right, because only God can produce fertile ground and allow that kind of growth. Be ready to sow when God presents a fertile heart. That's our job. Let's go make disciples. Father, thank you so much for this look at how Jesus taught and why he taught the way He did, but also that we need to be prepared to teach others when we have a chance, and to be ready for that opportunity and that Spirit's prompt. God, help us to have fertile ground in our own lives and to be ready to sow on fertile ground when You give us the opportunity. It's in Your Son's name we pray.